So welcome everybody. I am Christina Eatwig. I am the Faculty Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And welcome. This is an important topic to have a dialogue today on changing Title IX policy and the changing context of sexual assault and sexual misconduct policies on college campuses, not just here, but across the state and across the nation. I want us to stop and think about some statistics that you may already well be familiar with, but let them sink in one more time. 1 in 5 women will experience some form of sexual assault or violence over the course of their lifetime. If you were to count off the women in this room by 5, that gives you an idea of how impactful that statistic is. 1 in 16 men will also be a victim of sexual assault in their lifetime. In addition, we know that lesbian, gay, and non-binary individuals are even more vulnerable, and that vulnerability varies by race and by socioeconomic status and income. We also know that the age at which individuals are most likely to be affected by sexual violence is between ages 18 and 24. So it's during years in which many young people attend universities and colleges. So this is a principal reason why this issue is so significant on college campuses. Now, these statistics haven't changed much over the course of many years, unfortunately. But policies have. We have a policy called Title IX, which was originally passed in 1972 to forbid discrimination in educational institutions. And in 1977, it was first deployed to assure that sexual violence in educational institutions, and sexual harassment as well, would not impede education on the basis of sex. And we've seen that go through various cycles over time. Most recently, a strengthening of Title IX policy under the Obama administration in 2011, in which guidelines were released that encouraged universities to follow specific practices in order to remain eligible for federal funding. We then saw this past fall, in September of 2017, a rescinding of those guidelines and a loosening of those guidelines under the current presidential administration. So there's been a lot of movement. There's been controversy over both the strengthening in 2011 and over the loosening in 2017. And parallel to these changes, we've had a lot of incidents happen across the country, including close to home. I sat in this room last fall in a conversation, listening to a conversation that Professor Elgin was a part of, about Title IX policy in relationship to the Gopher football team in the controversy over an alleged gang rape last September 2016. And we now have another sports incident just last month in relationship to the basketball team. And there are many, many other incidents that have happened that don't hit the news, right? But which affect individuals on this campus on an everyday basis. So these combined changes at the federal level and these local incidents that have drawn attention have led to increasing concern and scrutiny over the policies that we have, whether it's at the federal level or whether it's at the university level. Those of us who work or attend this university and this university system know that this semester a new president's policy on sexual misconduct is being rolled out. We also know that the state university system is considering changes and reforms to its sexual violence policies that are on the books. So things are happening at multiple different levels. And we are here today to talk about what this all adds up to. What does it mean that we've seen these fluctuations in federal policy? What is the role of the state of Minnesota and state legislators and policymakers in this policy realm? And what is going on at the university level, and how is it reacting to these local incidents as well as federal changes? So what we have done here today is the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy has invited a number of speakers with different viewpoints and different kinds of expertise to speak to this issue. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're going to move into a dialogue about this question. To my right is Representative Erin Murphy. She represents District 64A in St. Paul. She has been a member of the Minnesota legislature since 2006 and is a former majority leader in the House. We've asked Representative Murphy to be with us today because she's the author of proposed legislation on affirmative consent policies for all public universities in the state. This legislation also proposes to provide funding to incentivize greater programming in relationship to prevention of sexual violence. I've also asked her to speak about the role of the state and state policy in this policy realm. Next to Representative Murphy, we have Professor Karen Miksch. She is Associate Professor of Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development in the College of Education and Human Development. Her research focuses on Title IX, so she is well suited for talking with us today, not only because her research is in this realm, but also because she is a former civil rights attorney and is co-chair of the University of Minnesota's President's Initiative to Prevent Sexual Misconduct. Next to Karen Miksch is Rose Myra. Rose is a PhD candidate in American Studies. In addition to her academic studies on U.S. colonialism and empire, she's a volunteer at the Sexual Violence Center in Minneapolis, so works quite directly in questions of sexual violence. And she is co-author of a Dear Colleagues letter expressing concern about mandatory reporting policies. And this was a letter that was circulated through the university among faculty in particular recently. And finally, we have Lena Palacios, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. Her research provides a critical perspective on both criminal justice and sexual violence, and she has a passion for this issue. I've invited her also as co-author of the mentioned Dear Colleagues letter to provide us perspective on that. So the way I'm going to start our conversation is by asking a framing question to each of our panelists so they can say something about what they bring to the table. And then we'll open it up for audience dialogue and conversation. I will fill in with additional questions if we have a lull in the conversation. So I'm going to do my first question here from the podium, and then I'll take a seat there. And I'm going to start with Representative Murphy. If you could tell us, Representative Murphy, what you see as the role of state government in sexual violence policies on university campuses. Is there a role for it, and do we need it in addition to the attention that has been placed on this issue by both the federal government and by universities themselves? And then if you could tell us briefly about your legislation with regard to affirmative consent and why you think that that's an important issue as part of our policies.
Thank you, and good afternoon. And just by way of background, I want to let you know that I am a nurse, practice nursing here at the University of Minnesota, and one of the things that nursing and I think that I bring with me as a policymaker is the idea that we should find solutions and options for people even around our hardest issues. And this is one of those issues, right, that is challenging us, I think, across this country, and certainly on our college campuses. So early in my legislative career, I worked with MCASA, a Coalition Against Sexual Assault, to try and secure funding for the Department of Health to do more work on sexual violence prevention. And I remember working on that piece of legislation with my colleagues in the legislature and recognizing how inept we were at the time, and probably still are, talking about the issue of sexual violence and how that is different from sexual intimacy. As a legislative body, talking about those issues in a public forum challenged us. So we created a little caucus so we could practice together, and I was surprised when that caucus came together how many Democrats and Republicans, members of the House and the Senate, joined that caucus because they understood that there was an issue and they wanted to get better at, more facile at talking about it. There's a woman I work with named Jess Nyman, and she was the person who brought to my attention in a public policy way the idea of pursuing a state policy around the idea of consent for our college campuses. And I, like I often do, got to work and drafted a piece of legislation and got it introduced, and with its introduction saw the emergence of all sorts of people who have a stake in the matter, of voice and expertise. That was 3 years ago. I have learned a tremendous amount just by the sheer introduction and the curiosity that comes with listening to people who have so much to say about this issue. And chief among them have been policy or student leaders on our college campuses. And when I started getting questions from student leaders on college campuses, I made my commitment to go to the campuses and spend time. And I will tell you that from my perspective, the leaders on our campuses are far ahead of the policymakers in the legislature. They are very clear, thank you, very clear about why it is important that we push hard to enact policies and the means to support those policies, to support the students, and that we get more clear about the ways in which we pursue justice for people who have experienced sexual assault. As a legislator, as I talk with Minnesotans, and especially with parents, nobody wants their children to go to a campus where they think they may be harmed. That's the value statement underneath this issue that I think can bring us together. And if you look at the National Climate Survey, and we heard those numbers, right? This is an issue that has really not abated. There is a high rate of sexual assault and sexual misconduct on campuses, not limited to campuses. We know it's true in the state capitol now. We know it's true in the Catholic Church. We know it's true in workplaces. So I think we have an endemic issue in our country, and it's worthy of our attention. As I worked with student leaders, and we really didn't meet with hard resistance, instead of hard resistance, we met with sort of like, what are you doing? We've got this under control on our campuses, so that we'll work with you, but we're not really into this you weighing in on this issue attitude, which you can encounter sometimes as a policymaker. I went back to the students to ask, do you really think that we should pursue a statewide policy, or would it be better for me to join you and try and make sure each campus has a good policy? And they said, we need a state policy to back this up. And I think that's right. I think that's right as we watch how challenging this issue is for us. And if we really believe that we can use public policy to improve a situation for our campuses and for the students on our campuses, then a state policy I think is important, and that's why I've pursued it. I will confess that it has been hard to get bipartisan support for the legislation, and really among Democrats and Republicans there is some reticence around this issue, and it's in part because I think people don't really understand fully what we're talking about. And as we listen to Americans talk about sexual misconduct in the wake of the Me Too movement, it is evidently clear, abundantly clear to me, that we have a long way to go if we want to make sure young men, women, LGBT, trans students are safe on our college campuses, but really to make sure that we all are able to live freely and participate freely in our society, whether it is on college campuses or in the workplace or in our politics. And that's why I think this issue is so important. And I'm really glad to be here with you today and to be with the experts on this panel to continue the pursuit of both public policy and campus policies that will advance this cause. Thank you.
So, Professor Miksch, if you could give us a little bit of background on how the university has responded to changes in Title IX policy at the federal level here in the state of Minnesota, University of Minnesota system.
Sure. So I think we've responded in a couple ways, and I'm going to put on two different hats maybe. One is my higher ed law scholar hat, and the other is as the co-chair of the President's Initiative to Prevent Sexual Misconduct. And I just want to unpack that. By sexual misconduct, we mean rape, sexualized violence, sexual harassment here on the campus. And so that's a prevention initiative, so we'll talk about that second, but I want to talk first about some of the legal issues that are involved here on the federal level. So when the Dear Colleague letters were rescinded, so these were Dear Colleague letters that were issued in 2011, and really the first time we saw with the Trump administration was that they no longer were supporting some of the policies of the Obama administration for transgender students, and so they withdrew from a federal case. where they were supporting a transgender student's right to use the restroom that he identified with. And so that was our first, and because there were also Dear Colleague letters issued in 2013 and 2014 that really were very clear that transgender students were protected by Title IX and that all LGBTQ students were covered by those provisions. And so that was our first intimation, and then the Dear Colleague letters from 2011 were also rescinded. I study higher education, and in meeting with people and getting questions on this area, people were very concerned that somehow now Title IX was just eviscerated. Title IX is still the law, okay? And so those Dear Colleague letters were the Obama administration's interpretation of how universities and K-12 schools should carry out those provisions. But the law is still there, so we still have a federal law that prohibits sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and provides affirmative duties on college campuses around sexual assault and other kinds of sexualized violence. So that's one thing, that piece is still there. We also have state law, and our state law may require more than Title IX. So affirmative consent is an example of a state law policy that actually goes beyond what is required under Title IX. And the state law can do that. This is an area where the state can regulate. But we also have campus policies. So that brings me back to two policies on our campus, or one policy and one initiative. So it's the Regents policy, and I want to get the name right, so I have to put my glasses on. This is not an affect, I can't see. It's not like the professor, everything I can see it. Sexual harassment, sexual assault, stalking, and relationship. And this is a policy that was adopted by the Regents on October 13, 2017. That particular policy is the one that we'll, I'm sure, also be talking about today, that has provisions that make faculty and staff mandatory reporters when they are made aware of sexualized violence, rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. It also comes from a consent decree, some of that language, from a consent decree that the university entered into back in 2015, where there was an Office of Civil Rights investigation on campus, several actually, and the university agreed that faculty and staff would be mandatory reporters. Some people had already been mandatory reporters, which means if somebody discloses to you, you're supposed to contact someone, but others weren't. And there was also, depending on what college you were in or what unit you were in, you might disclose to different people. And now it all goes through the Title IX coordinator's office. And each campus has one in the University of Minnesota system, and that's who those things get reported to. So that's the policy that took effect on October 13th of 2017. Starting, at least over a year ago, the president put together an initiative. I see some of the members of working groups from this panel, as well as in the audience and on the coordinating committee. And I was asked to be on the coordinating committee in August of this year. And then I think I spoke too much at the meeting, and then I became co-chair, along with Dean John Finnegan, who is the Dean of Public Health. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this work is because I'm very passionate about civil rights. I'm very passionate about access and equity in education, and the idea that everyone has a right to meaningful participation. And that is what this initiative, to me, is really all about. But I was also excited to work with my colleagues across the university and in the School of Public Health, because we're using a public health model. And this is something that isn't always used in these kinds of prevention campaigns on college campuses. And having talked with my colleagues around the country, they're very interested to see too how this model might be something that they can use on their campuses as well. So this is a prevention initiative. And so there's a focus on training and education for all members of the university community. Since I've been here, I came to the university in 2000. I've never had any training on Title IX. I do training on Title IX because it's an area that I study, but I've never had one as a university faculty member until last week when I took the online training. And I would just like to point out too, that's just the first step. So we're really now in this phase of the initiative, really looking to provide training that meets students where they are. So as Christina was saying, this issue doesn't affect everyone the same, right? So we need to make sure that we have trainings that are really, and workshops that are really geared towards the issues that folks are facing on campus. A staff member who is transgender is going to experience these issues potentially differently than an undergraduate student who is cisgender and straight, right? So we need to make sure that we keep that intersectionality piece at the heart of our trainings. And so there's a student engagement committee that's looking at graduate, professional, and undergrad. Those can be very different experiences. We have a group that's looking at faculty and staff training. I'm mentioning these because I hope that you'll all reach out and get involved. We also have a group that's looking at evaluation and a subcommittee that's looking at research. We have a group that's looking at institutional accountability because we know that's really, really important. And we also have some oversight that we're doing on these issues as well. So we're looking to reach out and get as many people as are interested involved, and there's a variety of different ways to get involved. So I think I'll stop at that point, and thank you.
Erin, if I could ask you just one follow-up question. My understanding is that the university-wide policy has opted to maintain a preponderance of evidence standard, which was not necessarily required anymore as of September 2017. Could you speak to that just briefly?
Sure. So the preponderance of the evidence standard is more likely than not, and it's a standard that we use in civil cases, and that is the standard that we're using going forward. There's probably a continuum of the level of due process that is used in, there is a continuum of due process that is afforded to individuals on college campuses. Some of these are at conduct hearings. Some of these might be judicial committee here on our campus if a faculty member thinks that their academic freedom was violated or thinks that, for example, that an investigation around sexual harassment was mishandled, they can grieve that to judicial committee. Other employees go to conflict resolution. Graduate students in their graduate student role have facilities to go through the graduate school, but there's also a student conduct hearing. And so the policy, the Regents policy, does say that they'll use the preponderance of the evidence standard. And there's also, you have a right, or you may bring counsel with you to that hearing as well. And some universities provide that and some don't. We do, and there's certainly a debate on that as well.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on now to the question of, actually returning to this question of mandatory reporting, which was the subject of a dear colleague letter written by the co-authors here. And I'd like to split up the question, maybe asking Professor Palacios first to speak to what are some of the issues you find that are problematic with regard to mandatory reporting, and for Rose Myron to speak a little bit about what some of the alternatives might be. And I think this is something many people are wondering about, right? In the sense that you observe the Larry Nassar hearings, the athletic doctor out of Michigan, and wonder if mandatory reporting were in place, would that have continued to happen? Or if that's not the right approach, what are the alternatives that can prevent something like that happening once again? So if you could begin.
I'm grabbing this one instead of this one. Hi. Thank you for organizing this panel, Christina. I think it's really important and it's very timely. Again, my name is Lena Palacios, and I am an assistant professor in gender, women's, sexuality studies. And I just want to position myself because I also think it's very important to be able to do that, because in many of my classes that I teach in African American studies and gender studies, many of the courses I teach are focused on how do we position ourselves and situate our identities. So I will say to you pretty much up front I am a queer Chicana, I'm first generation. I am a survivor of sexual violence as well as of state violence, and I take this issue of sexual violence extremely seriously, and I also consider myself an intersectional feminist. And I think these things are important because many of these things we're speaking about that are basically presented to us as alternatives, many of them are coming from top-bottom visions of change that actually neglect the amazing input and interventions that have actually been led mostly by student activists across the country who have really actually done the heavy lifting to educate us about how violence, sexual violence in particular, is imbricated, co-imbricated with issues of racialized violence, sexualized violence, and gendered violence. And so when we end up talking about these issues, I think it's really important to understand that many of the times and the reason behind, some of the work that Rose and I have done and other faculty who are in faculty, students, and staff who represent the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Initiative, the reason that we have been concerned is that the fact that many of these policies barely challenge endemic, institutionalized histories of sexual violence in university and college campuses. And these histories, and I'll keep on saying it, impact all of us differently. And I will say that public health literature, I'm also a fellow in the School of Medicine, and I do work on this issue from a public health lens as well, that much of this work has actually shown that the majority of people who are most impacted by sexual violence on college and university campuses are also those who actually lack institutional power of any kind. And those will be people who are gender non-normative, international students, students with physical and intellectual disabilities, students who are undocumented, and mostly women of color. In particular, Black women have actually, research has shown, Black women are very much impacted by issues of violence on campus. And yet, when we look at numbers, 80 to 95% of students do not report incidents of sexual violence that happen to them while they're students on campus. So the reason, again, to talk a little bit, just to kind of give you a little bit of background, many of you in this audience are now mandatory reporters, even certain undergrads are. If you're an employee of the university, you are a mandatory reporter. If you are an adjunct, you are a mandatory reporter. If you are a graduate student instructor, you are as well. I am. My colleague here, Rose, who's an amazing graduate student in American Studies. And the reason we're really troubled by that is that, and I want to be clear about this, I do work in restorative and transformative justice all the time, which is basically looking at non-state interventions to sexual violence. If a person who's a victim or survivor, for example, wants to actually do work within the legal and state system to rectify, to seek remediation, to pursue a legal course of action, to even call the cops, there is nothing that I will do as a supporter of that person to say not a good idea. So the point we're trying to make is that if a student, and most of the times, this is important to recognize, as professors, we are the first responders. 9 times out of 10, research shows that. Students many times have already come to me to disclose histories of sexual violence. If that student, for example, actually wants to continue to pursue and file a complaint, I have absolutely no problem supporting them every step of the way and making sure that the access services of Title IX to send them to the Aurora Center, as well as to offer them many amazing resources like the Sexual Violence Center that exists off campus. That is my responsibility. However, what is happening right now is that the way that the policy is being shaped is that if a student does not want to actually pursue legal action, does not want to be sent to the Title IX office, where there actually is not a guarantee of confidentiality, that student is basically put at an unnecessary risk. And that is a key problem, especially because of the fact that if the student was hurt by an employee, that there's already going to be basically an increase in terms of how that student will have to interface with other legal mechanisms. And that may also include campus police and off-campus police and medical practitioners, et cetera. And what we see in the public health research is that many students are not very comfortable with that idea. Once they know that you are a mandatory reporter, it has a chilling effect on actually students coming up to us now. And we've seen this across the country and across the board. There's actually a decline in students reporting because now they know that they may be sent down the river to actually have to be able to deal with this. And it does not, at this point, deal with the fact that many of the students that I work with are actually not comfortable dealing with, interfacing with the police because of also their non-normative location. Whether, again, they are women of color, whether, again, they are trans or gender non-conforming. And as the cases that we have seen here in Minnesota, for example, and across the country in the Anna Doe case, people familiar with Anna Doe, in 2017 in New York City, cops actually are basically have high records of perpetuating sexual violence against many people they target and arrest. And in the state of Minnesota, let me just put this, I'll close. But what I'm trying to say here basically is that the way that mandatory reporting, no matter what my colleague here says about how it is based on intersectionality, et cetera, not one person who works in RIGS, whether student, staff, or faculty, was even adequately consulted about the fact that this was actually coming down the pipeline. No student activists I know were adequately consulted about having their expertise and their cutting edge work in the community on campus respected and actually be able to be integrated in these trainings that are now coming down the pipeline, by which they're actually by a company called EverFi that are making a big profit right now and rushing to help universities basically protect themselves. Okay, protect themselves against further legal assault, because this is what it is. Mandatory reporting is really not about helping empower survivors and victims, because it is not survivor or victim-centered, but it is really about legally protecting the university against lawsuits by victims and survivors. Because, as we know, universities have done a really great job in protecting victims and survivors, and I mean that very sarcastically. So I'm a little angry, you can tell, I'm a little bit angry, because again, we have been doing amazing work, but yet our voices are not in this policy. Our trainings, our activism, our pedagogy are not in this policy. And I really think that at this time, this is the time when our voices should be at the forefront of these movements, both on campus and off. Because we are the ones that are the most impacted by violence. We should be the ones at the table, actually shaping this policy and be able to actually have a voice in how these things come down the pipeline. Thank you.
Before I move to Rose and ask about what some alternatives would be to mandatory reporting, I want to clarify with you, Lena. The way that I read the university policy, the Regents policy, is that it's mandatory to report to the Title IX office, but it's up to the student whether they want to take it any further. So, tell me how
that's
that
inaccurate. It's inaccurate because a couple of things happen. The fact is that while the Title IX, let me just say, first off, I really have an issue with students actually being sent to speak to lawyers before they actually can maybe, I would actually prefer that students are able to go to the Aurora Center, where they actually will be speaking with people that, are not just interested in protecting the legal rights of the university, but are actually a little bit more invested in really caring about students' mental health and well-being. That's number one, okay? So now they're being sent now to the Title IX office. Now, what's nice is that students are not going to be forced into actually pursuing legal action or filing a complaint. However, there are real loopholes here. Okay, there are loopholes if an employee is involved in the sexual violence. And there are also loopholes in terms of how the university and how Title IX can actually define whether or not, for example, the person who has perpetuated this particular assault is a repeat offender, right? Or whether that there is a certain present danger. And not just in terms of the individual student, but in terms of across campus. So already other layers are triggered and opened up in terms of police involvement coming in. So what I'm trying to say is that that type of where students actually have autonomy and have basically their rights explained to them, I think there are too many blurred lines for me to be comfortable to actually sending my students to a place where they may end up not being protected, or they may end up actually having to pursue something. And I just want to say one thing. Recently, a professor at Harvard University ended up protecting one of her graduate students because she was a mandatory reporter, yet she did not disclose. She lost her job because of it. Some of us may applaud that, but I want to explain that this particular professor knew that the person who assaulted the student was a very well-known and respected academic who had a lot of play in the university power structure. And this particular female professor knew that if this graduate student disclosed, what kind of hell she would be met with in terms of losing her funding, in terms of being removed from the department and losing her career, basically, being blacklisted as an up-and-coming academic. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to be, and this is important when we talk about affirmative consent, I don't want to talk about affirmative consent until we are very clear about how sexual violence is about power and control. If we're not clear about that, then all of this is for naught. And that is important. Power imbalances are very central to us talking about this. And we cannot just make this issue individual. We should not just be talking about student-on-student crime, when in fact many of the sexual violence that I see as a professor is being perpetuated by my colleagues or faculty, as well as administration.
Okay, so let's now give the floor to Rose and move the conversation to what can we do to improve the situation we're in. And if right now it's certainly not up for change anytime soon, the brand new university-wide policy that includes mandatory reporting. But if it were to be, what would be alternatives that you would see to the mandatory reporting and the problems that Professor Palacios has raised?
Sure. So, as Lena was just saying, I think the biggest issue that we kind of took up within this new policy is the issue of mandated reporting. As Christina said when she introduced me, I'm currently a volunteer at the Sexual Violence Center. I'm not a representative of them by any means, but what that means is that I've had 40 hours of training in sexual violence and that I work with victim survivors on a weekly basis. And I think the biggest thing that I take from that on a weekly basis is that, as Lena just said, sexual violence is about power and control. And when we are faced with that reality, what we really wanted to take up was, if sexual violence is about power and control, let's not take more power away from victim survivors when they are in the process of dealing with the repercussions of sexual violence, and when they're in the process of disclosing that information to a professor, an advisor, a friend, maybe anybody that would be a mandated reporter and might force them to report. So, I think the easiest alternative that we proposed in the letter was, if you want to make faculty and staff mandated reporters when a student explicitly says, I want to report, right? I want to report, I want to file charges, I want this to move forward, fine. Like, make faculty and staff mandatory reporters in that instance only. And, going back to what you were saying earlier about Michigan State, in theory, that would have prevented what's happening at Michigan State right now, because people did come forward. People came forward and specifically said, I wanted to report, and nobody did anything. That was not a situation where people didn't say that I want to report, and this kind of mandated reporting policy would have prevented that. That's not the case. So what we are proposing is that it's not a blanket mandated report, because what we know is that victim survivors of sexual violence, everybody's situation is different, and everybody should get the right to define what's safe for them, what makes sense for them in their particular situation, and we want to restore power to those individuals rather than take it away by forcing them to report or deal directly with the Title IX office if they don't want to. And so I think that's kind of the most clear alternative that we wanted to lay out. The other thing, though, is what Lena was just saying with the type of training that this policy proposes, particularly the EverFi training that's going to be implemented throughout the university. In thinking about what we should do about sexual violence, there's very little to no evidence that mandated reporting significantly changes the rates of sexual violence on college campuses. And so instead of covering ourselves legally through mandated reporting, what we really believe is that the university should be taking a more comprehensive approach and really doing more training throughout the university for administrators, faculty, staff about sexual violence 101, about consent, about systems of oppression that intersect with sexual violence, like race and gender, and really, thinking about doing that in a more comprehensive way through required courses or required workshops or required trainings that are trauma-informed and that are victim-survivor centered. And from what we know about the EverFi training right now, that's not the case. It's a very cookie-cutter training that's going to be vastly implemented to a very diverse group of people. And so one of the alternatives that we've really pushed for is tap into the experts who are on this campus, tap into the experts who are in this community who have experience with sexual violence, and let them be at the table and decide what kind of trainings we should do to really educate people on our campus about sexual violence. So I think those are sort of the two things that we've especially focused on.
Okay, so we're now going to transition to a dialogue and your questions. My colleague Deb Fitzpatrick will be walking around with a wireless microphone. And as you gather your thoughts, I wanted to take a minute and welcome Regent Chu, who is in the back. Thank you for coming and attending. I know that Regent Peggy Lucas was planning on attending, but I'm not sure if she arrived. But it's really a pleasure to have you here and to have so many people in the room that have a vested interest in the policies that we are talking about today. So go ahead and put your hand up if you have a question. If you don't have a question, I will fill in. I will be repeating your question just for the purposes of the videotape that we have of the event itself. Are there questions that we've hit on a lot of issues, kind of two pieces, the policy itself and the components within it, as well as the training that's to come. Those of us on this campus know that soon we will have electronic training and then a whole set of trainings that there is an opportunity to really shape what those trainings look like yet, because it's not yet been beyond the initial electronic training decided to my knowledge. Are there questions? Feel free to, there's one, good.
I will ask one. Thank you all a lot. I learned a lot listening to all of you. I have completed the training, and I just do have to say, and I'm not an expert, but I'm grateful for it. I think that it certainly it won't change anything, but I believe it gives us a common starting point. And I think that seems really important when we're starting with nothing. Karen, that you said you've been here so long and never had any training. The fact that this university is saying you can't work here after June if you haven't completed this, to me is a huge step. Not the best step, not the only step, but a huge first step. So I'm grateful for it, and I just wanted you to know that. I also, I struggle with this, this question of mandatory reporting. I remember when we had these same conversations a number of years ago, although I'm the dean here now, I was in K-12 education, and we had similar conversations about mandated reporting in child abuse, and what would be the chilling effect of it. And as we all know, we do have mandated reporters in that whole arena, and part of the compelling argument was, God forbid, that there should ever be a time when we fail to triangulate multiple victims with one perpetrator such that we just didn't know what we didn't know and couldn't stop it. And that really, I find chilling. Lawsuit aside, that's what I find most chilling about what happened in Michigan. And so your point about the mandated reporting might not have changed that is compelling to me, but I still have that concern that if we don't start there, might we run the risk of allowing more people to be victimized simply because we didn't do what we could to stop it?
Should we take one more question and then let's take 3 questions to make sure we've got enough audience participation. Go ahead.
Hi, forgive me if I'm simplifying this, but I'm trying to understand. There's a policy in place. It's already been voted on and it's in place now. And mandatory reporting is part of that policy.
That's correct.
And what I'm hearing, and what certainly I've experienced in the world, and if you're paying attention to the news, we're hearing that there is a process of re-traumatization that is in the, it's like a pipeline, that when someone's initially harmed, there are multiple ways they can be re-traumatized as they seek redress that we can prevent, because we know what those re-traumatization patterns are. This is well known. It's through the legal system, police, in the process of trying to regain dignity, power, and agency after a crime has been committed against you. This is a very sensitive and re-traumatizing process. Why would there not be an alternative once that person has disclosed that there has been a crime, for them to go, here's door number A, I want to go to the Title IX office and use all the powers of the law that are at my discretion to follow this through. Here's a different door. I've chosen not to do that. I just don't understand why that isn't implicit. I mean, it just seems like common sense. Forgive me if I'm missing something, but why would that not be put in the power of the person who's been victimized? What's the payoff for not giving the person that power? What is the payoff? I was listening to something on the radio as I came here, and they were talking about human resources and the departments that deal with these issues, and some caller said, well, remember, the human resource department works for the corporation. So you have to follow that line of allegiance. To me, when you're a student at a university, the line of allegiance should always be to the student. So I understand that the university has protective policies, and it's important to have due process. But I would like help understanding why that wasn't written into the policy. And number one, and if number two, is it too late? Can it be addressed? Can it be amended?
Okay, let's take one more question and then have some answers, and we'll go back for another round of questions. I think there's a student.
Okay. My question has to do with the other side of the equation, which is, how do we stop this? You know, we're sitting in an educational institution, the University of Minnesota, Humphrey School in particular. The public policy is great, but it's like, how do we stop this from happening with our children and growing up with the idea that this can still happen? It has to do with power and control, who owns it, you know, and who gets to, or how do we hand it down to our children, whether they're boys, girls, or whatever. And so I'd just like to hear what the panel has to say about the prevention aspect of this.
Okay. Can we take one more? There's a student here in the middle.
Thank you. My question is about the applicability of the changes in the policy to hiring standards for the University of Minnesota. You know, whether there will be some sort of standard of behavior that will need to be kind of vetted, I suppose, before people are hired. And the example that I have in mind is I know that Senator Al Franken has been interested in perhaps joining the staff of the Humphrey School as adjunct faculty, and I personally have some real reservations about that, so I'd love your thoughts on how that will play out.
Okay, so if we could maybe address the second question first, about whether we can change this policy at this stage, and how did this policy come to be, if there's any knowledge on the panel with regard to the mandatory reporting, and then move to the question that digs into mandatory reporting and more questioning whether we should be opposed to this or for it. And I think implicit in the question from Dean Bloomberg also was a parallel to the K-12 system where we know it's been implemented. Is it an appropriate parallel here at the university level? And then questions of prevention, how do we stop this, and hiring standards, what kinds of implications does this have? Who would like to start? That's open. Karen, do you know some of the background of the policy adoption?
So what I know is, so I am a member of Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee, which is a faculty senate committee, and so I remember the policy coming to our committee. I believe it went to faculty consultative committee, students consultative committee. So some of the shared governance aspects of the university and the different committees. I also was several years ago asked to sit on an ad hoc committee where we looked at recommendations from an external review of the university that's public. It's 735 pages, I believe, of an external review, and that had recommendations in it as well. And it was in reading that report that I first became aware that the university had entered into a consent decree with the Office of Civil Rights, and part of that consent decree was mandated reporting. Because that particular incident, and I don't know much about it because of course that's confidential, but from the external report, which is public, was that someone had reported and the individual was a mandated reporter and did not report. Or at least that seemed to be what had happened there. And that had happened more than once, and part of the concern was, for some people, was I didn't know who to report to, and so there was some confusion on that, and the other part was that people didn't report. So I believe that's where then the existing sexual harassment, sexual violence, and policy was revisited by the regents, but I'm not a regent, and so I wasn't involved in all of that, but I did see the policy and I made comments on it when it was under a 30-day comment period. And then the policy came out. Whether it can be revisited again, of course, all our regential policies can be revisited, but again, they're regential policies.
Okay. And how about these additional questions about mandatory reporting in comparisons to K-12? Can we use this triangulation as a way to prevent further abuses?
Sure. So, I agree with you, that, it would be chilling if we found out that, multiple people were assaulted by the same person and we didn't know about it. That said, I still think that giving the victim survivor the power to make those decisions is more important. I think that individuals should get to decide what's best for them, and especially because of concerns with safety, if that same individual hurt multiple people, they must have a lot of power. They must have a lot of influence and they must be able to do a lot. And I would be terrified if I was one of those people, especially if I didn't know that there were other people out there that, or even if I did, that, that were hurt by the same person. I would be terrified to come forward, and for good reason. I also just want to say, there's a lot of opinions about this, but I don't necessarily think that the K-12 comparison is necessarily applicable here. I think college students are an entirely different population of people than children, and I think there are very real arguments for mandatory reporting when somebody's under the age of 18 versus in college. And, I have my own opinions about that, and so do other people, but I'm not sure it's quite the same situation here, in my opinion.
And I just want to follow up on that point that I think is really important, is that when we look at issues of mandatory reporting when children are involved, we also need to be very critical about how mandatory reporting, like the Violence Against Women's Act, Again, another policy that came from a place of very good intention has actually backfired and has actually criminalized many of the victims and survivors of domestic and sexual assault, especially through mandatory arrest policies. And so what I want to say is that when we think about mandatory reporting in K-12, it's very interesting to look at who has actually been basically charged and targeted under these programs. And you'll see a very interesting preponderance of trans and gender non-conforming people. And I think that when we even think about issues of mandatory reporting at the university, there is actual growing anecdotal evidence that a lot of mandatory reporting as it is instituted now across the country is actually targeting, many times unfairly, basically complaints are being lodged by cis, usually white, and heteronormative students who just don't feel comfortable with having a trans body teach them in the classroom. So I think that's really important to understand how, again, the road to hell is paved many times with good intentions, and we need to be very careful about how these policies may end up targeting the most vulnerable, racialized and gender non-conforming people who teach at universities who are already in a precarious situation. And the second point I want to say just very quickly is that under the Obama administration, it was really, it was your point, and I think it's really important that the White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault and the Student Affairs Administration administrators in higher education have both said that mandatory reporting policy infantilizes both victims and survivors, period. And we actually have the quotes here. We have all the quotes in our letter. We have about 10 copies. And you're also free to email me or Rose, and we can send it to you for you to look at with works cited. But basically, it infantilizes particularly girls and women, which I find to be very problematic, even though, again, it's not just girls and women who are victimized. They're the ones that are usually seen as non-agental objects that cannot make a rational decision on their own. That's the way it's portrayed.
So if we could circle just to the hiring question and then come back to what I think is a really big question that there will be a lot of comments on about how do we stop this. But do we know of any proposals for standards in hiring in relationship to this? I guess we don't know, but that might be an initiative to consider and think about. And so on that note, I think I'd like to frame a little bit more the question of how do we stop this. As I reviewed the university policy last night in preparation for this panel, it is really directed at faculty and staff and what faculty and staff need to do, whether it's reporting or whether it's training. But that doesn't necessarily address this bigger question of how to stop it. It's more about how to contain it in terms of how the policy is written. And when we think of and this is a way I think I can also bring back in the legislation that Representative Murphy has proposed, which is about affirmative consent, which has been part of University of Minnesota policy since 2014, but it's not part of all public colleges and universities in the state. So, and that is really student-centered, right? So that might be one tool in terms of stopping that's more student-centered. We have this university policy that's very staff and faculty-centered, but when we really get into questions of how is this happening in the first place, you think of incidents like the sports teams that get lots of media attention. But sporting events are one place, and sporting locations are one place where we're seeing greater incidents of sexual violence. Fraternities are another place where we're seeing greater incidents of sexual violence on campus. So thinking about the cultures on campus and where this happens is something that I certainly noticed as I was reading the variety of policies was not something so far that I was able to recognize. Now maybe it's something that's envisioned in the broader variety of trainings that Karen had mentioned, but if the panelists could speak to this question, like how do we go about stopping it? Is it state level legislation on affirmative consent? mixing up my consonants and vowels. Or perhaps other policies at the state level or university level. How are we going to address and stop the root problem?
Well, I pursued I'm pursuing the legislation around consent because I am interested in prevention, and it is one way for us to advance the idea that the relationship between two people must be a consensual relationship. I was at a rally. I've got a couple of colleagues, Lindsay Port, a friend of mine, and Erin McQuaid, who reported incidents of sexual harassment, and Lindsay in particular has paid a significant price for that report. And they're looking for a task force in the legislature to advance the idea of how we're dealing with this issue at the Capitol. So I was at a rally, and of course there's been this robust conversation since the resignations of Senator Schoen, Representative Cornish, Senator Franken, and I continue to hear from people, especially women older than me, wow, it's really not that big of a deal. You know what happened? It's, a hand on someone's behind, what's that big deal? And I say back, it's not a big deal if the person whose bottom was touched gave their okay. Right? That simple idea of consent is not complicated when we think about it in other constructs, but in the construct of sexual intimacy, and then alternatively sexual assault, that idea is absent or missing or romanticized in ways that I think blur the lines of the affirmative yes. And when I listen to students talk about enthusiastic yes versus the passive no being sexy, they are so clear, right? And the students that I have listened to, including Joel Stangler, who was a student leader here, and Abir Said and others, have really pushed me and others to drive a conversation about comprehensive sexual education for young people and making sure we're including curriculum for our K-12 students. So that concept about consent, which does not have to be about sexual intimacy or sexual participation, but really about agency, is rooted in us as we grow up. And that's a big question for us, but I think that's how we pursue prevention. When I think about the incidents, the stories that we've heard as a result of the criminal case against Larry Nassar, those young athletes, those young students who told their parents and they didn't believe them, they reported and didn't get action. That is part of the endemic nature of what we're dealing with, and it's heartbreaking. It is literally heartbreaking for those families. And so while I come here fully invested in political action, because I believe in it as a tool for our democracy, the Me Too movement is a political movement that can advance solutions and the idea that we don't have to accept this as the norm. And as I have listened especially to elected women who have served longer than I have, over and over again they have said, well, we just accepted it because we thought we would lose our power if we didn't. And for people that are younger than me, that's no good. They're saying hell no to that, right? And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to advance the idea of prevention. And I believe that we must, if we want to make sure everyone is able to live fully and freely, and we recognize, of course, that the root of this is power and control, and that's no good for any of us. So I do think it is a hard question. I do think there's a public policy role, there is a political role, but again, student leaders on college campuses, and now all of the student senates on all of our state campuses have adopted a policy, and they're pushing their administrators on the idea of consent because they're really hungry for us to make progress on this issue. One last thing, I'm sorry I'm saying so much. Practical tools. There is an organization out of Duluth called Men as Peacemakers. The Women's Foundation in Minnesota has been really stellar in advancing this question. And they sent me to Duluth to meet with Men as Peacemakers. They have been working with more male-oriented campus organizations on college campuses, fraternities, athletic groups, and helping students figure out how to live on their college campuses safely, to recognize the predatory behavior that some may impose or use at parties, at sporting events, etc., that track people. And so as a matter of practical tools, I think they're out there, and we need to embrace them more on our college campuses and use all the voices, right? This is often viewed as an issue of women, but it is not. Victim survivors are women and men and gay and lesbian, transgender, queer. We are hearing that clearly. And for all their sakes, we gotta step up our game and make sure that our campuses are safe, our workplaces are safe.
Would others like to add in terms of what can we do to stop it?
I'd like to say that many faculty and student-led efforts have started up around the country to really fight for victim-centered processes and policy change, for actually bringing students who have already been doing substantial work in this area to the table, to actually create and get paid and support for much of the non-paid activist labor they've done on campuses to address these issues of consent and power imbalances and anti-oppression work. And there's also been a real move for us to actually not just co-opt the language of intersectionality that comes from Black feminist organizers, but actually to really embrace it. And I think what's really amazing is that in this letter that we wrote, we found that many people are very, not just us, but there are many people that are unhappy with the way that mandatory reporting has been implemented, because it really doesn't just remove victim survivor autonomy, but it also really diminishes the fact that many people have already been fighting and struggling on this issue for years. And it neglects to center their amazing work, and instead it's over-relying on cookie-cutter corporate web-based applications to educate us about something that's extremely endemic and serious, when we really need to have more one-on-one conversations. And the last point I want to say is that your question about the hiring process is a damn right good one, because I just want to put it like this, is that we can't even get to a place where we can really embrace these policies if we can't even start asking questions about how decision-making is done in these universities. It is very top-bottom, and there's no recourse for people who have basically been having to deal with the same type of perpetuator over and over again. These people always have they have different faces, but they always usually, again, amass a lot of institutional power, a lot of academic recognition and awards, and they get away with it all the time. And I think that we need to be able to, as students, as faculty, as staff who are in precarious situations, to continue to put pressure on the administration to open up decision-making, to make sure things are truly democratic and participatory. And I wanted to say one last thing. These workshops and trainings that we're now talking about, that will be more student-led and more based on anti-oppression and more based on intersectionality, that's not top-bottom, that's bottom-up. That's actually coming because of some of the pressure that we, who co-wrote this letter, and I want to say that most of the people that helped me out, Jane Swift is another one, is a grad student, most of them are graduate students and undergraduate students who are actually putting themselves on the line to do this work. They're not being paid or given awards by administration to do this. And they're the ones now putting pressure on the administration to say, you know what? These web-based trainings are BS. We have a better alternative, and guess what? It's better alternative that's premised on best practices that are supported by public health research and medical research, and we have been doing this for years. So support what we have been doing instead of going outside of the university to find corporate-based, like I said, web-based developers who are making a killing financially, when we have the resources here. We're an amazingly diverse university with amazing resources here, and we really should elevate and empower the people that are already here.
So let's take a couple more questions before we run out of time.
I'm very concerned about the role of the Aurora Center, and I wonder if any of you could speak more about that. In the past, when I would have a student come to me and disclose, I would send them to the Aurora Center knowing that that student's agency would be maintained and confidentiality will be maintained. Is that going to be preserved? Are they now mandated reporters? And how do they fit into this whole scheme?
That's an important question. Let's gather 2 or 3 more. Let's stick with 2 because we have enough time.
Hi, I want to thank all of you. This conversation about trainings is really important. Obviously, I'm a graduate instructor, and so this affects me, but my concern, more so than trainings for us, is also what is the university doing to make students' rights legible to them, both in terms of transparency, but also in terms of the language in which it's discussed, because a lot of times it comes out as very monolithic, hard to understand, and so it's easier to just kind of think about the university as a system that is beyond your understanding, and that you aren't empowered to understand that you do have rights within the system. So I really want to know if the university is doing anything to make students more aware of what their rights actually are.
We're going to be doing another web-based training.
One more question. There was one other question.
Forgive me for my need to follow up. What is the process to amend it so that the mandatory reporting is not mandatory for the student to be endowed with the choice? Because it seems to me that's a power issue and a control issue. And if in a policy that's being written to protect students, if there is a device by which that student can be injured again because their choice is being taken away, that seems to me to be a continued institutional wound, and it seems regressive to put that into policy.
Okay, I wanted to just get one more question. This woman, a couple of people in the front have had their hands up since the last round.
So my question actually is a follow-up sort of to the proposal that you were bringing up, Representative Murphy. When I think of affirmative consent, I think of the work of sex education. But the question itself is more about this general conversation we're having about prevention. So my question maybe is directed to you, Karen, but maybe it's for all of us, which is, what is the role and what sort of resources and mandate is the university willing to commit to a comprehensive, truly intersectional, pleasure-centered, trauma-informed, LGBTQ inclusive sex education? The World Health Organization, I'm not a public health scholar, I'm a humanist, but I know that the World Health Organization and other organizations have found that sex ed plays a role in decreasing gender-based and sexual violence. So.
Take one more.
Okay. My question is about the alternative proposed. Thinking about option A is all of the legal recourse and option B is not that. And specifically related to knowing that a lot of oppressed communities are disproportionately harmed through legal, police, medical systems. And so I'm wondering in option, if folks want to choose door B, how are we bumping that out, and how is door B going to give folks what they need besides just not option A?
Okay, so maybe we could start with a question about the Aurora Center. How is that impacted by the mandatory reporting policy?
So my reading of the policy is that anybody who would have a confidential relationship, so any counselor at the Boynton Health, for example, anyone involved in victim advocacy, so that would include the Aurora Center, is exempt from mandated reporting. And so this may go to the question too, well, what's behind door number B? The idea there would be I think it's imperative that students know of the variety of resources that are available to them on campus, and that sometimes requires some assistance in navigating. So whether it's another student that helps you navigate, a faculty member, an advisor, another staff person, we need to make sure that people know what those resources are. We need to make sure that those resources are funded so that when people do come forward and want assistance, that that assistance is there for them. Same thing for staff and faculty. We do have within our benefit packages some opportunity to seek out counseling, but it's limited. And so the question is, if more people start to seek that out, will that be covered? We also know that not everybody wants to go to a therapist, right? That's a particular model that doesn't work for everyone. So what other kinds of resources are available, I think, is really, really key. The other thing I think, if I could, about prevention, so in the initiative to prevent sexual misconduct, we did there was an initial report that went out, and there was a 30-day comment period. And one of the things we heard very loud and clear in that is that the EverFi training, which is being rolled out right now, which is an online training, that was inadequate. And we totally agreed. And so this second phase of the initiative, or really the start of the initiative, is that Rebecca Roper-Silman, who's the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, and Professor Chris Evans, and other members of faculty and staff are getting together to provide some templates, not really templates, but train the trainer type materials, bring in some outside resources, but as everyone's mentioned, we have so many amazing resources on campus, let alone in our community here in Minnesota. We have those resources here. And so how do we make sure that those workshops and trainings in a variety of places meet our context, that they're based in our context, right? If I go into a department or a unit that I don't know anything about, they're going to say to me, well, Karen, you don't know anything about our context, right? So how do I make sure that we have folks and that it's sustainable, because that's permeating throughout the institution. So I believe several members of the audience, and I know a number of faculty and others and staff and graduate students are working on these various working groups to try to make sure that those workshops and trainings are very effective, and then also they're offered in multiple ways, so they're meeting the needs of diverse groups. I think that there's the key to the prevention is, and come from nursing, is this public health model that rather than always, of course we're going to focus on what's going on in the individual, because the individuals need and deserve our support and to be treated with dignity. But the idea is we need to go upriver. What are the root causes? Why do we have these inordinate power imbalances? What is going on that we can work on to prevent so it doesn't happen in the first place? And that's not blaming victims, that's not somehow keeping it at the individual level. It's looking at it as a systemic problem, which we have on our campus, and trying to figure out, and in our society and on campuses around the country, and trying to figure out what are those root causes, what do we do to get rid of those, at the same time that we're also providing support for survivors.
And that's a nice segue to the question about comprehensive training, I think, in terms of sex education. I don't know if Representative Murphy, if you wanted to speak to that, it was somewhat directed towards you.
Sure. I was on a college campus in Minnesota having a conversation about this, and there was a faculty member there who was in part responsible for implementing the policy and supporting students. And at the start of that discussion, the faculty member said, we've got this pretty in hand. And as the students started telling their stories, it was abundantly clear that that wasn't the case. And it was a hard conversation. But at the end of it, the faculty member said, we do need more help. What they had been doing in terms of implementing the policy was essentially distributing the student handbook that had the policy in it, expecting the students to read it, right? To say, yes, I have read it and I understand it, which is a very short version of training. It's not really training, but it has some of that similar impact. You all understand what the policy is here, don't violate the policy. And I think that is, it doesn't recognize the scope of the issue that we're trying and needing to contend with here. And so it helps shape the work that I'm doing in terms of we need more funding for college campuses. If we're going to expect a policy to be put in place and implemented, then there needs to be more funding for how are we getting and embedding that policy, and how are we supporting victim survivors. And I will just say, from my perspective, the Aurora Center in particular has been an outstanding gem for the state of Minnesota, and there are campuses that are wrestling with this. It is just in the shadows, if you will. It is not front and center for the policies of a lot of the campuses until we really say, we got to deal with this. And the issues as you're describing them, intersectional issues, and what that means for people and for students, we're not going to get after it in a way that we should. So that's part of the reason why I think the legislation is important.
Okay, just one kind of a shout out to Jenny Steiner, who's sitting over here, who's one of the grad students in higher ed, who really taught me through some of the work that she's been doing that students come to campus with very varied levels of knowledge about healthy relationships and intimate relationships. And I think that's one thing on college campuses that sometimes we make assumptions about that we shouldn't be making assumptions about that. And so thinking about what are those courses that we offer on our campus, I know in family social science and certainly other places on campus, there's courses on intimate relationships and healthy environments and those types of things. So how do we, again, help students navigate to those? How do we make sure that those are funded? And then going to your point about transparency, one of the things that I've spent pretty much my whole time as a lawyer is trying to take legal documents and make them accessible, because law impacts us, right? Sometimes in very disempowering ways. And so how do we try to open that system up? Well, one way is to make it understandable, right? And that's where I think that's one of the reasons why, among many, that students have been such leaders in this movement, because they can talk about it in a way that makes it real and loses some of the verbiage that lawyers and others like to add in. So thanks for that question. It was really important.
So I think we have time for one more response, or two.
I'm going to share this with Rose, but I'll be really quick. One of the ways, basically the way that we wrote a 20-page single-space letter, and we've been doing more grassroots type activism, really trying to educate folks. And basically, it's a great way to make policy legible. But I think it's more important also to really let students have an understanding, and faculty and staff, about how disempowered they truly are in the university. I think it's very important to have that discussion. And I've had it. I teach a course in African American studies and gender, women, and sexuality studies that it deals very frontally with issues of sexualized, racialized, and gendered violence. And we have already had some really amazing conversations about how mandatory reporting, for example, Violence Against Women's Act, etc., basically how these policies are truly implemented, and how social movement activists, who again are really the people who are forcing the issue, how many of their concerns are co-opted, watered down, diluted, and how they're usually very much silenced, especially one of the radical critiques that they have in terms of power. So I think that this has been, even though you're probably hearing me, extremely angry about how things are working here, I think, at one level, it's been very rewarding to be able to actually bring up these issues. I find actually more energy right now to bring up these issues and center them as a part of my curriculum. But I think that we really truly want victim-centered work to be done, and this goes to the question the woman in the red asked, is that we really should make sure that now mandatory reporting policy should be impacted by those most impacted by violence. And so I really believe that people who are at the forefront of doing this work, student activists who identify as victims and survivors, faculty and staff, are given a seat at the table, and not so much as given a seat at the pre-existing table, but are basically trained about how policies functions and how decisions are made at this university, so that we can actually make the changes we want to see. And I do want to just say, again, this is not a done deal. People are fighting and people are making changes. The last thing, just the last thing I want to say, one of my concerns has to do with the fact I just told you I'm teaching a course called Pleasure, Intimacy, and Violence. We theorize about sexual violence every day in my class. Do you know how many students are disclosing? What does this mean for academic freedom? To me, is a question that we have not raised today, and it is truly frightening. The AAUP, Association of American University Professors, have come out very strongly against mandatory reporting because they rightly understand it to be an attack on academic freedom, especially for those professors who actually talk about racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence. What are we going to do? Send all the students who disclose to the Title IX office? They might as well send myself to the Title IX office because, again, I'm also situating my own self in this work. Thank you.
So let's give Rose the last word, about 1 minute.
Sure. I'll keep it brief. So, I just want to kind of touch on the most recent round of questions and also the larger question of what do we do about this going forward, just by kind of touching on some of the initiatives that we've proposed and are still fighting for within this initiative. So, I think the first thing with the question about the Aurora Center, yes, absolutely. The first thing on the top of our list should be to include the people who have been doing this work already and fund them and give them leadership roles to drive this process. The second thing I want to talk about gets to the, if people aren't reporting, what is the door B option, and then also talking about students' rights and making those transparent. I think part of the other sort of issue that we have with the existing trainings is that the trainings are entirely or mostly about mandated reporting and not enough about how do we actually just support students, right? So if faculty and graduate students who are in teaching roles or in other sort of employee roles where somebody would be disclosing to them, like Lena said earlier, we often are the first responders, right, when it comes to meeting with students who are disclosing. They should not only have the option to not report, but faculty and graduate students who are in those roles should be trained to respond to students that are coming to them. They should have to go through trauma-informed training to be able to say, I'm really sorry this happened to you and I believe you. And these are some resources that I can point you to and let me know what I can do for you, right? And that's not something that people receive on this campus when they're in faculty or graduate student roles or in teaching positions of any kind. And so that's one of the things that we're also pushing for. And then finally, just to the question about, Jane's question about sex ed, I completely agree. I think that's a very important portion of sexual violence training. And I just also really want to emphasize that in addition to what Representative Murphy said before about, comprehensive education at an early age, I think, we should have mandated courses in this at the university. I mean, sexual violence is based in centuries of colonialism and power and rape culture and toxic masculinity, and those words are foreign to way too many people on this campus. And I think that in order to end this and to how do we move forward, we need much more education around the roots of sexual violence. Thank you.
With that, thank you. I want to thank our panelists for taking out a good portion of their day for some really stimulating comments and questions and answers, and to all the audience members for coming and caring about this issue. So hope to see you again soon. Yay.